Alrighty, and let me see, is it 3? And as it is 3, I will let everybody in. Admit all. Alrighty. Right, everyone looks to be admitted whenever you're ready.
Perfect. So hello everyone, and welcome to today's quest session. So before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge that I'm affiliated with UNB, which stands on the unsurrendered and unceded traditional Wolastoqey land, as established in a series of peace and friendship treaties. This is just a reminder that the session today is being recorded. If you would like to be added to our mailing list, if you're not already, Kelsey will put the email address in the chat now. So just send a message to that email address and you'll be kept up to date on events. So the topic of today's session is supporting the engagement of people living with dementia in qualitative research using storytelling techniques. And here to talk about that with us is Emma Conway. Emma is a doctoral candidate at the University of Waterloo, working under the supervision of Dr. Carrie McKaney. Emma's research focuses on a central concept. People with dementia often face challenges communicating their experiences, which can impact their ability to participate in research. Adapted or modified methods are needed to better promote the accessibility of research for people with dementia. Emma's dissertation examines the current use of adapted or modified research methods to engage people with dementia in research and examines 2 storytelling techniques for their utility in improving this engagement. Through this, Emma's work contributes to the understanding of adapted and modified methods to engage with people with dementia in research. Improving accessible research opportunities for people with dementia, improving accessible research opportunities for people with dementia to share their experiences is essential for recognizing the human rights of people with dementia to have equal opportunities to participate. So as for questions today, if you think of them as the presentation's ongoing, just add them into the chat and I'll keep an eye on them and I'll raise them with Emma as she's speaking. There will also be time after the presentation to address any questions as well. So while Emma is presenting, we're just going to keep everybody on mute to hear things clearly. And that's it for housekeeping items. So I will now turn it over to Emma.
Thanks, Rachel. I feel like I don't even need to present now. You covered everything so well. But yeah, as Rachel said, my name is Emma Conway. I'm a PhD candidate here at the University of Waterloo. So I'm really happy to be joining you virtually. It's great to see you all today. And as Rachel mentioned, please feel free to note any comments or questions in the chat. I want this presentation to be really conversational and casual. So I'm open to your questions at any time. So I'll get started. So I included this lovely photo that is definitely aging myself. But this is the last time that we were in New Brunswick as a family. This is probably like 2004. So really dating myself, but we had a lot of fun on that family trip. So just wanted to connect back to this land as I'm here today to share with you. So for our agenda today, we're going to go over some things about communication and how we communicate with others to learn about their experiences. And as Rachel mentioned, the primary focus of my research is on people living with dementia or with people living with dementia. We'll also go through some of the storytelling activities that I included in my dissertation research and give a little bit of a study overview and engage in a bit of a reflective exercise of the procedure part of my study, just to give you a lot of information on the methodology should you choose to incorporate it in your future studies. All right, so as we know, there are a growing number of older adults living with dementia in Canada. However, historically, the perspectives of people with dementia have been largely excluded from health and social research that informs policy and practice. This is in part due to methodological and communicative challenges, as well as perceptions or assumptions about cognitive decline, capacity, and stigma. Of course, to ensure the relevance of research outcomes and related policy and practice, the perspectives of people with dementia must be included. Further, it is becoming more regularly acknowledged that people living with dementia are active users of services instead of passive recipients, and thus they should be involved in their design and delivery. Service users, in this case people living with dementia, have the right to choose and change supports and services they engage with, in reflection of their own needs, preferences, and abilities. Thus, further research that works to capture the experiences of people living with dementia with regards to their support and service use is needed. However, as I mentioned, it is hard for people living with dementia to participate in research sometimes. Current methods available are insufficient to capture their experiences due to their lack of consideration of the communicative challenges experienced by many people living with dementia. Dementia impacts a person's ability to communicate in different ways, as dementia impacts individuals differently. As such, it's important to include a range of experiences in research. As we know, people with dementia are most often older adults, and thus their experience of dementia is not in isolation from their experience of other age-related challenges. This can include hearing and visual impairment, either related to their dementia or the aging process. Still, research supports that people with dementia are often able to articulate their experiences and offer valuable contributions to research on relevant supports and services. Adaptations to existing methods, such as surveys or semi-structured or structured interviews, are often necessary to promote the inclusion of people with dementia in research. And while adaptations or modifications alone may be sufficient to support participation for some people, for others, they're often inadequate to support, people at various stages of the disease trajectory. They often rely on direct questioning or recall, which can be really challenging for some people living with dementia. Thus, more accessible methods, such as those that I'm going to talk about today, are warranted for use in populations of people with dementia. So when thinking about adaptations that could be made to support communication, one such method that we identified through a preliminary search was that of projective techniques. You may have heard of this before if you ever taken a psychology course in your undergrad, but projective techniques are derived from the psychological theory of projection. You might remember those ink blot tests where whatever you see is indicative of your inner thoughts and motivations. So this theory posits that people will perceive stimuli in the context of their own expectations and motives, and will credit others with their attitudes, beliefs, and dispositions. That is, it is a human assumption that others are like us. Projective techniques are based on the principle that when presented with an ambiguous situation, participants will project their unconscious desires and feelings onto their answers. Projective techniques have been increasingly common in marketing and development research, which is interesting when you consider the position of people living with dementia as service users who should have the opportunity to be actively involved in service development. There are several different types of projective techniques, but the ones of particular interest in this research are called construction techniques. Construction techniques require the participant to respond to a situation by making up a story or a description. Most commonly, this involves a set of ambiguous prompts or pictures, which are shown to participants to elicit a storyline, and the participant's answer is thought to be representative of their own attitudes or feelings. This type of storytelling research has been studied with people with dementia, but not as a data collection technique, and its impact on engagement in research has not been previously investigated. So researchers have demonstrated the resilience of storytelling in people with dementia. This includes the retained ability to express one's personal narratives, even when coping with progressive cognitive impairment. Conversational approaches like storytelling or life story methods have been shown to support people with dementia in expressing their experiences. A gap remains, however, in terms of the potential of storytelling and more broadly projective techniques in improving the engagement of people with dementia in research. Connecting to the history of projective techniques and in dementia research, the use of generic prompts and photographs has been demonstrated to successfully stimulate the recollection of personal narratives. Further, the use of generic photographs is thought to be more accessible to people with dementia as a conversational prompt, as it doesn't require them to recall a specific memory or report on a photograph with any accuracy, which would be expected if the photographs used were personal to the participant. The use of generic photographs removes the expectation that the participant will tell the right story. Also, direct questioning in interviews can add social pressure for participants to answer in a socially acceptable manner. And for people with dementia, this can include feeling pressured to answer a question correctly. The use of indirect projective techniques in interviews are thought to potentially remove this barrier. So despite the growing use of different innovative, modified, or adapted methods in dementia research, there is still limited evidence on the effectiveness or the impact of these methods on actually improving the engagement of people living with dementia in research activities. That is to say, we have a very limited evidence base as to whether these adaptations and techniques actually work. In order to evaluate the utility of these projective interviewing techniques, which for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to refer to them as storytelling techniques, in research with people with dementia. We conducted a qualitative multi-method study to examine, one, how does the use of storytelling techniques impact the data collected as compared to semi-structured interviewing techniques? And further, does the use of storytelling techniques impact engagement for people living with dementia? So in order to address our research questions, we conducted a series of 3 interviews with a total of 12 participants, so a total of 36 interviews. We recruited participants online, and we opened participation to anyone who identified as living with dementia in Canada. All of the interviews were conducted online in 2022, and participants ranged in age from 58 to 92 years old, with an average age of 70 years. 7 of the participants in this study identified as women, and 5 identified as men. 7 lived with their spouse or family, and 5 lived alone. All participants identified their racial, cultural, or ethnic origins as being white. All participants self-identified as having been diagnosed with dementia and considered themselves to be in early to middle stages of their dementia journey. For a bit of background on the structure of this study, participants took part in interviews a week apart. I used a counterbalance design of semi-structured interviews, storytelling techniques with verbal prompts only, and storytelling techniques with photograph prompts. So the order in which they participated in these different interviews was varied and balanced. And we maintained an interval of 1 week apart to try to counter for any recall or biases or ordering effects. So all the interviews were transcribed, and the transcripts were analyzed using qualitative content analysis. We also video recorded the interviews, and we scored these videos on the engagement of a person with dementia scale, which is an observational scale that we modified for use in this study. Scores from semi-structured interviewing techniques and the storytelling techniques were compared, and we contrasted to see if the data was different and what did people talk about. Focusing on the methods and procedure of the study, I'll go through a reflection of the study process in the following slides and share a bit more about the storytelling framework, the prompts, and the photographs used, as well as the results of the study. So starting at the beginning, it's important to develop rapport for any relationship, but especially when you're embarking on this type of exercise. Sharing about one's experience with illness with a relative stranger can be uncomfortable for a lot of people. Conducting interviews online can also be really unfamiliar to participants. In this study, I worked in a decent chunk of time just for getting to know the participant and for them to get to know me. I offered various modes of connection: email, text, phone, video conferencing, whatever they preferred. I conducted a pre-screening questionnaire conversationally, and I made notes of things they shared with me in order to customize the stories and the interview guides later on. Participants self-scheduled their interview time slots at a time convenient for them, and I shared necessary information about the study in advance, such as the purpose and the nature of participation, as well as the recording process, and ensure they understood and agreed to participate. Consent for this study was gathered on an ongoing basis since there were 3 interview time points, plus a pre-screening questionnaire. At each interview, I restated the purposes and the process of recording. It was important for me to reflect on the perspective of the people who agreed to participate in this study. They were often older adults living with some form of cognitive impairment, reaching out to a graduate student to participate in her study. They were brave, and I was so lucky. That set the tone for the interviews. We were learning and creating together. I wasn't the expert, they were. For setting up the story, I put thought into the photos and the prompts that I used, information about the storyline that was provided to the participants, alongside the broader topic of the study, which was their experiences with supports and service use in the community. For this study, we were interested in participants' experiences with accessing community supports and services, as well as their day-to-day experiences of living with dementia. Thus, the narratives followed the stories of Norma and Frank. Little was pre-constructed about the characters. They were introduced as people living with dementia in the community. I invited the participants to co-create the rest of the story through the interview exercise. Where did the character live? Did they have family or friends supporting them? What did they find challenging in their day-to-day life? There was no right or wrong answers. Through the construction of the story, there were opportunities to prompt for the participant's own experience. Have you ever felt like that? What about you? Have you shared that experience? After the story was introduced, I might use prompts like, what type of tasks does Norma find challenging? What advice do you think she would give to others? What is she feeling, or what is she thinking about? We also leveraged photographs in some interviews as additional prompts and anchoring points for the discussion. This is our character, Frank, and these are a couple examples of photographs we used in interviews for storytelling techniques. Recognizing the often sensitive nature of conversations about one's own diagnosis and experience, the interviews were very conversational in tone and followed a pace set by the participants. While an interview guide was developed in advance, it was leveraged mostly as additional conversational prompts on an as-needed basis. I tried to minimize the amount of space that I took up in the interview, asking only questions when needed and providing additional prompts or ideas when requested. As a result, the participants were largely in charge of the course of the interview, in terms of how the story turned out, the details, if the person had a partner or not, where they lived, the specific challenges they incurred. That was all up to them. It was important to respect the participants' time, and the interviews were concluded promptly. We only took the time we needed to discuss the story. Often they came to a natural end. It was important to ensure the participants felt valued in this interaction. We spent a minute or two at the end of each interview reflecting on the character and the story, and I thank them for sharing their perspective with me. At the conclusion of the study, I sent each participant a thank you letter, alongside with a small token of thanks. And I was sure to communicate when they would receive a copy of the results and answer any questions they had. At the outset of each interview, I engaged in a reflective journaling exercise myself to document any logistical circumstances, my own perspectives, and anything to note for the next interview. And just to share a few quotations from the results of this study. So this is a quote from participant number 1, who's talking about Frank. Perhaps he's thinking through his diagnosis and what life is going to be like for him in the years ahead. He's giving a lot of thought to how he gets through every day, I think. He almost looks to me like he's going through, looking into his coffee and saying, what's next? I think he's wrestling with how best to get through. Yeah, that's really interesting. That was sort of what it was like when I was diagnosed. It took me rather a long time to get through that. I think it was nearly 18 months. But once I was finished feeling sorry for myself, then I could actually move on with a really positive attitude. So yeah, there's truth to that. This is from participant 12. If I were in his shoes, I think I would be rethinking where all the people in my life have gone. Have I alienated them in any way? I know once I came out of the closet in regard to my dementia, I lost all my friends but one. And now when we run into people that we know, they talk to my husband, they don't talk to me, as if I can't understand what they're saying. So I would think perhaps he's just pondering over his life, wondering where he went wrong as far as having somebody in his life when he needs them so badly. And from participant 4. Well, he's totally on his own. He's looking around and he's thinking, what's it all about? Like a lot of times I'm sitting there like that. And I'm just wondering, is this going to be me? I think about that all the time. And finally, from participant 3. Yeah, he doesn't have to worry about leaving the stove on, which can drain electricity. I've done that many times. I relate to Frank. If the meals have to be heated up either on the stove or the microwave, he'd need related instructions. And then the back end, depending on how far along he is, like me, I know myself, I have trouble following instructions, and he probably would have the same difficulty. So just to summarize the results of the study, as a reminder, we conducted qualitative content analysis of the interview transcripts and observational analysis of those video recordings. From these analysis, our study supports that people tended to give richer descriptions of the impact of their experiences in interviews with storytelling techniques. They moved beyond simply listing or describing events that had happened to them and really talked about the emotional impact that their life living with dementia might have had on them. People tended to engage in imaginative thinking, expanding on their own experiences above and beyond their responses in interviews with semi-structured techniques. We also observed statistically significant differences in overall levels of observed engagement. That is, engagement was observed to be higher in interviews where storytelling techniques were used. And last but not least, participants reported enjoying this experience. They reflected positively on the storytelling interviews, and I'll share a couple examples of that in the next slide. I just think that was a very, very interesting little thing to do because it did make me think about things that I hadn't thought about in a while. Some of the stuff I was saying is stuff that I myself have actually had. It makes you more aware of your own situation and think, oh yeah, I think I feel like he looks. So it triggers things. And I think that's a really good thing. From participant 15. It's nice that somebody's looking out after Frank. And me, it's nice to have people that really care for me. I really enjoyed this. Participant 4. And so just to conclude, this study explored the accessibility of 2 different projective interviewing or storytelling techniques to provide a means of increasing and enhancing participation in research with people with dementia. This research focused on engaging people with dementia to understand their experiences and how specific interviewing techniques may be used to better facilitate the engagement of older adults in virtual research. In conclusion, improving engagement in research for people with dementia can advance the collection of information about their individual experiences, needs, and preferences, as well as the uptake of this information in policy and practice in a manner that promotes a reflection of this information in supports and services. It can also support human rights as it promotes the equal participation of people with dementia in broader society. And finally, this research contributes to the understanding of research engagement for people with dementia, as well as provides an opportunity for this population to be involved in research that shapes future inquiry and practice. It also supports that storytelling techniques can better facilitate the participation of people with dementia in research, in turn creating more opportunities to be involved in research that informs supports and services in the future. So I just wanted to thank you so much for your attendance today. I hope you feel inspired by this to try something new when you're engaging with people with lived experience in your research in the future. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was fascinating. Right out of the gate, we have a question from Luke. So Luke says, great presentation, Emma. Could you sense any apprehension or anxiety in your participants at the outset of the interviews? And if so, how did you help them overcome it?
That's a great question, Luke. Yeah, I think it was interesting because the order of the interviews were different. So sometimes somebody would have a regular semi-structured interview first, and then a storytelling exercise, and then one with photos. And the next person would have, the storytelling exercise with photos first, and they wouldn't have the semi-structured interview until last. And so having that kind of variation, I think did, raise some questions for participants, but overall, I got really lucky. Like, the people that reached out to me to take part in this study were really open to the idea. And I think it did help kind of, setting the scene for those storytelling exercises, like no expectations. Like we can talk for 5 minutes, we can talk for 10 minutes, we can talk for an hour. We can talk about whatever you like. You can talk about your own experience. We can just stick to Frank's experience. So I think that helped, just kind of setting the scene that there were no right or wrong answers and that we were kind of just co-creating the story together. So yeah, I think there was a little bit of apprehension or anxiety for some folks, but just kind of keeping an open mind and promoting like a safe space to chat kind of helped with that, I think.
Perfect. And we have a question from Shelley.
Hi, thanks, Emma, for your very, very interesting presentation. I have a couple questions and they're, I guess, related. So as you know, we have used a projective technique in our interviews with people with dementia. And one of the things we're currently at the analysis stage, and I was just wondering if you had any feedback or input around doing the data analysis when some of the, as you know, some of the stories that we're hearing are more about other people's experiences and some are about their own experiences. So just how do you address that when you're doing the analysis? And I know it probably depends on your research question. So I guess that's my second question was around, are there research questions that are more amenable to this approach? So it's just really around research questions that are more amenable to this type of technique. And also how do you deal with at the data analysis stage when some are about their own lived experiences and some are more hypothetical?
Yeah,
Thanks.
for sure. That's a great question. So for this study, I was really trying to just assess, like, are these techniques useful? Like, do they work? Like, are they helpful to engage with people living with dementia? So while the topic was supports and services, that was more of like a tertiary, topic of discussion. And I do think these approaches are really amenable to customization. So the photos you choose, the stories you present, can really carve a path for how your discussion is going to go. So if you were interested in, for example, the other project we worked on, the experience of receiving a diagnosis, you could set that up for your characters. They're receiving a diagnosis, how do you think they would feel? You could, end of life, like any topic of conversation you could customize. So I do think that is a benefit to these types of techniques. In terms of how to manage responses that they may not link directly to their own experiences, I think that's where you really have to be open to leaning on the theoretical background of the techniques. The projective techniques like theoretical background state that when they're talking about the person in the story, that they're reflecting their own experiences. And I think that's something that comes up in broader dementia research too. We tend to have this obsession with accuracy, that we want what people are telling us to be the truth and accurate, and that it is 100% what reflects their experience. And I think as researchers, we kind of just have to accept that what they're sharing with us, that is their truth and that is accurate to them, even if they don't directly state like, and I felt like that, or that applies to me. They obviously have some type of connection with it if they're bringing it up. So it can be challenging, and especially when, you know, you have the constraints of like having a rigorous analysis and bringing in all these components. So it is tricky, and like you said, kind of depends on your research questions and what you're looking at. But I do think kind of having that acknowledgement, you know, in your rationale of your study, that you approach this as whatever they tell me is the data set, and we need not be concerned with whether it's the quote unquote truth, like it's their truth and that's acceptable. So that's how I personally would address that, you know, kind of challenge. But overall, I do think that it is a really interesting exercise to explore different topics, and even as an you know, an accoutrement, if you will, to a regular interview, just kind of adding some prompts in there that are maybe a little bit different than what you might expect in a traditional interview.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks,
Great.
Shelley.
We have another question from Walu. So Walu says, thank you for this presentation. Did you notice any differences in the ways that participants responded to the photographic versus textual storytelling cues?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually did. I thought it was really interesting that in Frank's story, so Frank had photographs and Norma did not. In Frank's story, 100% of the time, he was either widowed, living alone, divorced, or had no support person living with him because there was no one else in the picture, I think. Every single participant, that's how they constructed his life. He's living alone, which wasn't necessarily a problem, because for folks that didn't live alone, they could kind of contrast and, oh, I feel very lucky because that is not my situation, or I have this person that supports me. But there were a decent amount of people in our sample that did live alone, and so they could relate to Frank being on his own. Whereas in, you know, with just the verbal prompts with no photos, Norma always had a care partner. She always had family around. You know, she was attending support groups and day programs, whereas Frank was receiving PSW support and Meals on Wheels and those kind of things. So I think having a photo perhaps guided the story even more. Like there was more to go off of. Like he was obviously like a little older. You know, you could see how his house looked, or, you know, perceive those more visual prompts. So I think that did contribute to, as I was mentioning to Shelley before, like being really mindful of the pictures you choose, because people will kind of build off of what's in front of them. So if I wanted Frank to have a partner, then picking a photo of him with someone else in it would have been a good start. But again, we didn't really have any expectations going into this, so just kind of interesting how it all came together.
I was wondering about that when you were speaking about the photographic prompts, because like you know, an important piece of the storytelling is to avoid cueing, like intentionally or not, or unintentionally. But choosing the right kind of photograph while walking that kind of fine line must be difficult. Can you tell me a bit, like just describe a bit more about the process of like choosing the right photograph, you say, for example?
Yeah, for sure. So it really wasn't as serious as I might be making it sound. Like we went off of like available images online that kind of depicted you know, a person in a neutral state. So not super happy, not super sad, like just kind of ambiguous, like just a person just ambiguously there in the photo. We did pick one because this was during like some lockdown stuff happening in Ontario at the time. So we did pick one that had Frank wearing a mask, because we did have a few questions about like, how do you think the COVID pandemic would have impacted Frank, just due to the super fun time that everybody was living in. But yeah, so it wasn't, you know, a super complex process, but we aimed to have, you know, based on the committee's perspective as well as my own, like someone that appeared to us to be in a relatively neutral expression. And kind of just, he was just sitting, you know, having a coffee and not doing any sort of crazy activity, so that we could really build on the story and not have too many like visual cues. But again, I think you can be really flexible with the photos you choose based on the storyline that you're looking to explore.
Thanks for that. All right. Anybody else have questions or thoughts, or even
I
experience?
actually have a question. Sorry, I couldn't find the hand up icon. My apology. I was just wondering about your inclusion criteria. I know that for people with dementia, like there's obviously varying levels of that. And was that something that you had to take into consideration? And if so, like how did you kind of make sure that whenever you were meeting with your participants that they were in a space where they could effectively communicate with you?
Yeah, for sure. That's a really great question. So as I mentioned, we did do a pre-screening questionnaire. So whenever I would have someone reach out to me, or if their care partner reached out to me, I would schedule a time just to have an informal chat about like what the study was about, what participation involved. And then kind of towards the end of that call or however it took place, collect some demographic information. And so through the course of that pre-screener, I was able to conduct like a modified consent process. So basically where you kind of share some details about the study and then ask the person to either like kind of repeat them back to you or confirm they understand or ask any questions, just kind of assess their level of understanding. And so our consent model for this study was that if they were able to understand what was involved in participating, understand the recording process and agree to it, then they were able to provide consent. So everybody that we conducted the screener with was able to provide consent. Obviously, with this study being conducted online during the pandemic, all recruitment was also online. That kind of automatically limited our sample to people that were exposed to those recruitment flyers. So like people that were on Twitter or had a care partner on Twitter or were on Facebook or, you know, any of the other avenues that we used. So I think by nature of that was kind of like a almost forced limitation that people who tended to respond were in the earlier stages of their dementia journey.
Yes, thank you very much. That makes a lot of sense.
For sure. Thanks for your question.
So going forward, I'm not sure if you're at the point of sharing any results yet with some participants. Are you at that point yet?
Yeah, so we're just working on finalizing. There's 2 papers coming out of this work that are in the final stages of being drafted, at which point we will share kind of a summary of what we heard from both the transcripts as well as the optional analysis that we conducted, as well as just kind of a recap of, you know, what they took part in. And again, just thanking them for their time in participating. But I have had the chance to connect with participants kind of on an ongoing basis. Like it was a nice opportunity to develop some friendships as well. People participated from all over. Like I had coast to coast representation, although it was a small group. I had nearly, you know, at least one person in almost every province that participated. So that was really nice as well. So I have stayed in touch with quite a few people and yeah, I look forward to hearing their thoughts on the results. Yeah, thank you. As always, if any other questions or comments for me, you can reach out. I'm on Twitter. I'm not sure how much longer that platform will last, but you can catch me on email as well if you have any questions or want to chat anything to do with kind of storytelling techniques or engagement. I'm more than happy to connect.
Taking a quick look through here. If anybody has any other questions or... Well, we've got Emma. All right, I don't see anybody else right now. But again, thank you, Emma, so much for that presentation. I think we found it pretty fascinating. It's because you don't, I mean, it's quite unfamiliar to me, and I'm sure other people on this in today's session. So it's fascinating and overdue. So before we end, I just want to say that we are very excited to announce our next Quest session, which is on November 23rd at 3 p.m., where we'll have Dr. Sally Thorne from University of British Columbia, who will present on interpretive description and approach to applied qualitative research. And as Emma said, if you have any questions or comments that you want to send directly to her email's there. Otherwise, you can also send comments or questions to the email address shared at the beginning, and we can address that for you. And otherwise, we look forward to connecting again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Rachel. And I hope you all feel inspired to try something new and just kind of take a chance on a novel methodology because you might get surprised. positively. Thanks,
Thanks so
everyone. Take
much.
care.
Thanks, Emma. Bye.